Some traditions are older than the buildings they take place in. And on the morning of May 6, 2023, one woman rode straight into the middle of one such tradition, on horseback, in full military uniform behind the golden coach of a newly crowned king. She was 72 years old. She was his sister. And in a moment when the whole world was asking whether the monarchy should shrink, modernize, or simply disappear, she became the quiet, unbending answer. This is the story of Princess Anne, the coronation, and the tradition she refused to let slip away. For months before the crowning of King Charles III, one question hung over Buckingham Palace like a low cloud. In a modern country, in a modern century, what was a coronation even for? Critics called it expensive. Younger citizens shrugged. Newspapers debated whether the ancient ceremony belonged in a museum rather than in Westminster Abbey. The palace, aware of the mood, began trimming the event. It would be shorter than the Queen's crowning in 1953. Fewer guests, fewer grand titles on display. Charles wanted something that looked forward, not only back. Yet history could not simply be switched off. Some parts of a coronation are stitched so deeply into British life that removing them would leave a hole nobody knew how to fill. Among those threads was a role most people had never heard of, one with a name that sounded almost invented: Gold Stick in Waiting. It was into this role that King Charles placed his younger sister. Not a decorative gesture and not an accident. The position had once meant something dangerous and real, a trusted guardian who stayed close enough to the monarch to take a blow meant for the crown. That such a role would be filled by the king's own sister, rather than a soldier or stranger, said a great deal about the trust between them. Anne accepted without drama. She often did. While others in the family drew headlines for scandal or spectacle, she had spent decades doing the unglamorous work of duty, hundreds of engagements a year, few complaints, little noise. To the public she had become something rare, a royal people simply respected. Surveys placed her among the most admired members of the family, admired precisely because she seemed uninterested in being admired. And so, as the palace debated how much of the old world to keep, one of its steadiest figures prepared to carry a piece of that old world personally, on horseback, through the streets of London, whether the modern age approved or not. To understand why the role mattered, you have to travel back roughly 500 years to a nervous king and a very real fear of assassination. In the Tudor era, England's monarchs surrounded themselves with two chosen protectors, a gold stick and a silver stick, named for the ornate staffs they carried. Their job was blunt and vital: stay close to the sovereign, guard the body of the crown with your own. Over the centuries, the danger faded, but the honor did not. The staffs became ceremonial, the role reserved for only the greatest state occasions: a coronation, the opening of Parliament, a moment when the nation dressed itself in its full history. To be named Gold Stick was not a job. It was a statement about who the monarch trusted most. And qualified through decades of service. As Colonel of the Blues and Royals, part of the elite household cavalry, she held one of the few positions from which the roll could be drawn. After the death of Queen Elizabeth II, Charles had also made her senior colonel of the household division, quietly placing his sister at the heart of the army's ceremonial life. A palace source explained the choice simply: the king was rewarding her loyalty and her lifelong devotion to duty above all else. There was a personal weight to it, too. This was not a stranger in a uniform. This was the woman who had grown up beside Charles in the strange, watched, isolated world of royal childhood. They had shared a mother whose life belonged to the country before it belonged to them. When she rode behind his coach, she rode as someone who understood exactly what the crown had cost their family, and exactly why it still mattered. Anne had always seemed to grasp something her critics did not. The monarchy, to her, was never about the individual wearing the crown. It was about continuity, a long, steady thread connecting one century to the next, offering stability in a world that changed too fast for comfort. That belief would soon put her, gently but firmly, in the middle of the biggest argument surrounding her brother's coronation. Because while the palace was busy deciding what to cut, a camera crew arrived at St. James's Palace to ask the Princess Royal a very direct question. Did the monarchy still have a place in the modern world at all? Her answer would surprise the people who assumed the royal family had already made up its mind to shrink itself into something smaller, safer, and easier to defend. The interview took place in her own sitting room, and Anne did not dodge. When asked whether people were right to question the monarchy's relevance, she agreed that the conversation was fair, that such moments naturally invite that kind of discussion. But then she planted her flag. The monarchy, she said, offered a kind of long-term stability that was genuinely hard to find anywhere else. Then came the moment that made headlines. For years, commentators had described King Charles's vision as a slimmed-down monarchy, fewer working royals, a leaner institution, a smaller footprint for a skeptical age. It was treated almost as settled fact. Anne, with characteristic bluntness, pushed back. That idea, she suggested, had been dreamed up in a time when there were simply more royals to go around. From where she stood, she said plainly, it did not sound like a good idea. It was not a shout. It was not a rebellion. But coming from the hardest-working member of the family, days before the coronation, it landed hard. Here was the one royal almost nobody could accuse of self-interest, openly questioning the very direction the institution was said to be taking. If the woman who did the most work thought shrinking was a mistake, the argument suddenly looked very different. This was Anne's real intervention, not a secret order behind palace doors, but a public defense of tradition delivered in her own calm voice, at the exact moment the country was deciding what kind of monarchy it wanted. She was not trying to stop change. She was reminding everyone what stood to be lost if change went too far. The coronation service itself would reflect that same tension. Some traditions were kept almost untouched, stretching back nearly 1,000 years. Others were reshaped for a new era, most notably the homage of the people, which replaced the old homage of dukes and lords, inviting ordinary citizens to pledge their support instead. It drew both praise and controversy. The ceremony, one observer noted, looked much like 1953 on the surface, yet the people filling it were far more diverse than ever before. That, in the end, was the balance the palace was reaching for, and Anne embodied it perfectly. She was the living link to the old world, riding in a role born of Tudor fear, defending the value of continuity. And yet she carried it into a modern coronation being watched and questioned by millions who no longer took any of it for granted. Tradition would not be abandoned. But it would have to earn its place in front of a new audience. On the day itself, the ancient and the modern rode side by side down the same London streets. Ahead moved the gold state coach, gleaming and impossibly heavy, carrying the newly crowned king and queen. And directly behind it, upright on horseback in her decorated uniform, rode Princess Anne, gold-stick-in-waiting, guardian of a symbol, leading a procession of thousands of armed service personnel back toward Buckingham Palace. The image was quietly powerful. A 72-year-old woman, refusing a carriage, choosing instead to sit tall in the saddle in a role that once meant guarding a king with your life. She had even joked that the ceremonial uniform solved her outfit problem, a very Anne remark, brushing off the grandeur with dry humor. But beneath the joke was something serious. She had placed herself physically between the monarch and the world, exactly as the role had demanded for 5 centuries. When the coach reached the palace, she appeared once more, this time on the famous balcony, watching the aircraft roar overhead in the traditional flypast. For a few minutes, the crowd below and the family above shared the oldest kind of royal moment, pageantry, applause, and a sense that something continuous had survived one more transition of the crown. What made Anne's part in it all so memorable was not spectacle, it was meaning. In a coronation that had spent months negotiating with the modern age, trimming here, updating there, replacing old homage with new, she stood as the reminder of why any of it was kept at all. Not out of stubbornness, but out of belief. She had argued in public and in the saddle that continuity is worth protecting, that stability is harder to build than to break, and that some threads should not be cut simply because they are old. She never forced the palace to do anything. Her power was quieter than that and more lasting. She simply refused to treat tradition as an embarrassment, and by carrying it with such visible dignity, she made the case for it more convincingly than any speech could have. In the years since, the slimmed-down debate has continued, and the monarchy's future remains an open question. But that day offered one clear image to hold on to, the king's sister, guardian of an ancient office, riding through modern London to remind a doubting country of everything it still stood to keep. Whatever the monarchy becomes, it will remember that at the moment it hesitated between the old world and the new, its steadiest figure chose to defend the thread that ties them together.